My name is Curtis Chang, and welcome to Redeeming Babel, where our mission is to provide biblical thinking in a confusing world. In this video, I want to address the question, is the COVID vaccine a form of government control? Now, I believe that Christians have some legitimate complaints about government controls in the pandemic. But if we focus on that fear, we are missing Jesus' most necessary teaching. To understand why Christians especially fear the vaccine as a form of government control, we have to realize that in the age of COVID, government and churches have been increasingly clashing on the question, what is necessary? Early in the pandemic, local governments proclaimed that it was necessary for churches to close their in-person meetings. Even when churches were allowed to meet, public health agencies insisted that it was necessary for people to wear masks and maintain social distancing. All these ways that government defined what was necessary for churches was experienced by those churches as a form of control, and these churches rejected those definitions. Now, the government is proclaiming that the vaccine is necessary. Even though the vaccine program is completely voluntary, no one is being forced to get vaccinated, the government is still pushing it as necessary. And given the history of the conflict, some churches are primed to receive this latest definition of necessity as government control. How then are we to think biblically about this confusing situation? Let's start by first recognizing that some churches have a legitimate complaint about how governments have defined necessity during the pandemic. The most problematic example is found in Nevada, where the state allowed casinos to remain open while denying that same right to churches. In this case, the state of Nevada clearly deemed it was more necessary for people to gamble together than to worship together. The case reached the Supreme Court, where the church actually lost the case 5-4. I believe Christians are fully justified in appropriately challenging how governments distort understandings of necessity. In the biblical worldview, churches are far more necessary to the well-being of human beings than casinos are. And I believe the most appropriate way for churches to challenge government is through prayer, persuasion, and then legal action as a last resort. Unfortunately, too many churches have overreacted to their fear of government control by distorting biblical teaching on what is necessary. There have been case after case of churches practicing outright disobedience of public health officials. Some church leaders have justified these defiances by appealing to Acts 4, where Peter and John continue preaching even though Jewish authorities order them to stop. Now, it seems to me that using this passage in this way is a distortion of the Bible. Acts 4 is emphasizing the act of communicating about Jesus. None of the government regulations prevent this act. The rules might make it a little challenging, but not at all impossible. Even if one wants to stretch the meaning of Acts 4, remember that Acts 4 is only one story. It's always dangerous to pick one story in the Bible, blow that up into a general principle, especially when other Bible passages are more clearly stating a different principle. Regarding the necessity of obeying government authorities, Paul's words in Romans 13:1 declares with crystal clarity, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God." Remember that this is Paul speaking. Paul, the apostle who was beaten and imprisoned by the very governing authorities that he's insisting we all must still obey. Paul had to wear iron chains, and he said it was still necessary to obey the government. We Christians today have to wear cloth masks, and we're complaining that this is somehow intolerable. Besides ignoring the clear biblical command to obey the governing authorities, there's a bigger problem with how Christians are focusing on the issue of government control. Go back to the essence of the governments versus churches conflict. In this conflict, the Christian voice is reduced to defining what is necessary as what is necessary for me. The Christian is shouting to the world, it's not necessary for me to close down. It's not necessary for me to wear masks to maintain social distance. Now, that same Christian voice is claiming it's not necessary for me to get vaccinated. Here is the most important truth about Jesus for Christians to consider as we contemplate the vaccine. Jesus transforms the definition of what is necessary. In Jesus, what is truly necessary is not what is necessary for me, but rather what is necessary for others. Philippians 2, 4-7 describes this transformation beautifully. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. As God, Jesus had the right to avoid taking on the human condition. It was not necessary for Jesus to do so, but he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Instead, he emptied himself of that personal right and chose the form of a servant. On the cross, he became a servant of the entire world. The servant is mentally focused on what is necessary for others. So with the vaccine, as Christians, our primary question should be, is it necessary for others that we Christians take the vaccine? Here's the answer. It is necessary for others in the world that we Christians take the vaccine. It is necessary for Christians to take the vaccine to serve the world. This is because experts believe that a high percentage of people in the world must take the vaccine in order to remove the virus from continuing to circulate. This is what is called herd immunity. That percentage required for herd immunity has been estimated to range from 60 to 80%, with the latest estimates pushing it towards the higher end. Given our numbers in the US and in many parts of the world, what Christians decide will determine whether the world achieves herd immunity and whether the vaccine succeeds in bringing the pandemic to an end. This means that if enough Christians reject the vaccine because it is their right to do so, because they don't think it is necessary for them, then this will allow the virus to still circulate and replicate in the world. And there's an additional danger that goes along with a prolonged pandemic. The longer the virus circulates and spreads, the more opportunity it has to mutate. We're already seeing this happen. Given more chances to mutate, the virus is more likely to evolve into a form that gets around the vaccines. At the time of this recording, this hasn't happened yet and isn't probably going to happen for a while, which is why vaccines are a good idea for everyone right now. But people who reject the vaccine because they don't think it's necessary for themselves will be increasing the chances that this mutation could happen and ruin its long-term efficacy for everyone else. If you are someone who believes the vaccine is not necessary for me, you have a special opportunity. Your opportunity is to take the vaccine not as something necessary for yourself, but as necessary for others, for the world. Would you be willing to consider taking the vaccine as an act of servanthood? The virus has caused suffering for all of us. Let's all of us do what is truly necessary. The pandemic has spread person to person. Ending the pandemic will also spread person to person, as each of us shares the necessary truth about the vaccine to those who are unsure. If you know someone who would benefit from this video, please take the time to share it with them.